In the previous session, we positioned ourselves to approach the text by learning what the historical context of the book of Exodus is, as well as the literary context. With these two kind of guardrails in place, we can now proceed into the text. But before we do that, there's so many different kinds of genres within the Bible. There's typically 8 standard genres that we can find from Genesis through to Revelation. And each of them need to be approached a little bit different. The same way you would read an email differently than you would read a textbook, or you would read a poem differently than a biography. And so each one has the method of Bible study slightly adjusted, at least what you're looking for and observing. So the ones we have are Old Testament historical narrative, Old Testament law, we have poetry, we have prophetic literature, and then in the New Testament we have the Gospels, New Testament historical narrative, letters, and apocalyptic writing. And that's a little bit in the Old and New. But these are the standard genres that you're going to find through the text, and each of the books we're going to study in the seminar will have bits and pieces of each of these, and will offer insight and advice on how to observe and what to look for. So, as we jump into it, this being a historical narrative, it's important to understand, well, what is biblical historical narrative like? Most of the Old Testament, actually 40% of it, is historical narrative. It's the most used genre in the Old Testament. They're historical accounts of past events meant to give direction for a specific present moment, meaning Moses writes down the history of the people leaving Egypt to give information and to give guidance to the present generation that's entering into Canaan. And that's what we talked about last time, the challenges of leaving Egypt and entering Canaan. But in general, historical narratives have a plot. And the Bible, as one book, there's kind of 3 levels of plot you need to be aware of. You have what's called the meta-narrative, and that's the story from Genesis to Revelation. And that's what we did in our Bible overview in the opening sessions, where we traced the story of 4 sons. Now, there's a few ways to follow that meta-narrative from Genesis to Revelation, but that's the big plot. That's the overarching story, God's plan for our world. Then there's the second level, which is the Genesis to Malachi, the Old Testament narrative, and the Matthew to Revelation, the New Testament narrative. And they're very similar. Essentially, it's a story of the people of God in the Old Testament, and then the people of God in the New Testament, both constituted by sacrifice and covenant. And then you have the narrative of the individual book you're looking at. That's the third narrative. And we need to be mindful of all of these narratives when approaching the text. For example, when Moses is standing in front of the burning bush in chapter 3 of Exodus, how does that fit into the meta-narrative? How does that moment fit into God's story from Genesis to Revelation? And then in the second level, how does Moses standing in front of that bush fit into God's story for Israel in the Old Testament? And then lastly, how does that story fit into just the book of Exodus? So that's where a historical Old Testament historical narrative is a little bit different than maybe most narratives you'd be reading, because there's these 3 levels that we need to keep in our mind as we go through it. So as we observe and interpret, I'll pull those into our study today. Second major thing in a story after plot is characters. Now, in the Bible, we don't have a lot of typical characterization that we're used to. We don't know all the times their age, how they looked, even how they thought. But what we do see is through their words and actions, we're meant to determine, is that a good response? Is that a bad response? Is that something to follow, or is that something that we should typically stray away from? Rarely do we know their physical appearance, but when we do, it's very important. Same when we learn the age of a person, a character in the Bible. That's meant to add extra meaning. And so, as well, we'll see when we look at Moses, the name of each of these biblical characters somehow relates and can be interpreted into their story. Now, these characters in the Bible, again, we're not given if their action was right or wrong. Normally we find out whether it was right or wrong based on the consequences. But as we approach the Bible story and move into application, Many have said that the characters in the Bible, they're not models to follow, rather they're mirrors that show us really our own faults. So Moses' errors, we're also going to make similar errors in similar situations. And then lastly, for every good story after plot and character, you're going to have the setting. And the best way to explore setting is to jump right into the text. So imagine yourself, you're watching a movie or an opening scene of a play. And the beginning scene is of a castle, and there's a knight on a horse. You're already going to anticipate a certain narrative. Or say it's filmed in a hospital. You're going to anticipate a story with doctors and medical challenges and kind of a stressed storyline. You know what's coming based off of what's kind of the opening setting or scene. Now, it's the same in the Bible and in historical narratives. They always do this. The place where the story occurs has meaning. So in Exodus chapter 1, we see right off the bat, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. So the curtain pulls back and the book of Exodus is placed on the stage of Egypt. Now, typically today, as we read through that, it doesn't conjure up any ideas or imagery or feelings around that term. But what about for the original readers? What would that setting have meant to them? Now, this is the kind of third time that Egypt is very prominent in the biblical narrative. The first time is in the story of Abraham, where he ends up in Egypt, and then the story of his grandson, Jacob, when he ends up in Egypt as well with his whole family. And if you compare the story from Genesis 15, where Abraham goes to Egypt, and compare that to the story we find in the beginning of Exodus, it's rather interesting, the similarities. And we can see that the author is, or in the minds of the original readers, this is what Egypt represents. So if you remember the story, there's a famine in the land in Genesis 15. And because of the famine, Abraham leaves Canaan where he's living and goes to Egypt. Now he lies about his wife to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh takes his wife captive. Okay, so as soon as we get to Egypt, we see that it's a place where the people of God can easily be taken captive. But how does God deliver Sarah? Well, he delivers her by afflicting Pharaoh and his whole household with plagues, and then Pharaoh releases Sarah and Abraham and actually blesses them with a ton of goods. That sounds rather familiar, right? So at the end of Genesis, Jacob leads his whole family to Egypt because of a famine, and the same thing happens. Pharaoh takes captive and oppresses the Israelite people. And then we know the story. God rescues them with incredible acts of plagues and judgment on the nation of Egypt. And then they're released with all kinds of goods given to them. And so Egypt is a place you don't want to go. It's a place where you become captive, you become enslaved, and it's a place you're meant to avoid, which only one of the patriarchs was able to do so, and there's a rather interesting story with that. But that's what it conjures up. When the curtain rolls back on the book of Exodus and it starts in Egypt, that's the setting of the story. You're meant to imagine a story that's going to come after of captivity, but then a divine rescue. Another classic example of setting in the book of Exodus is wilderness. And just as much as Egypt brings forth a message, so too does the wilderness. And we'll talk about that when we arrive to it later on. So let's continue in. We talked about this yesterday. Exodus 1 verse 8. It says, "Now a new king arose over Egypt that did not know Joseph." Okay? This is probably the changing of dynasties, and this is the moment that Israel really was enslaved. Okay? At minimum 100 years before God begins to deliver the people through Moses. But then we have the build up to the story from the next two paragraphs, from 1:8 all the way to the end of the text of verse 22. We see an interesting repetition. Now, if you're following along and making observations, repetition again is one of the key observations that we need to make as we approach the text. You can see that the story from 8 to 14 is very similar to the story from 15 onwards. We have a story of Pharaoh oppressing the people of God, right? He sets taskmasters over them and he afflicts them with heavy burdens. But in the middle, there's a contrast. Verse 12. A contrast is a shift in the narrative. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. So as Pharaoh was trying to push out and destroy the people of God, God shows up and he turns it around and they actually multiply. Now that story again is repeated. Pharaoh responds with greater aggression in verse 15 and telling them to not just enslave them, but he commands the midwives in verse 16 to kill all of the newborn babies on the birth stool. And then notice in 17, there's a repetition of that contrast. But the midwives feared God, and the result is then again in verse 20, the people multiplied. So here we have the repetition. Pharaoh seeks to oppose God's people in their vulnerable state, and the result is, or the contrast is, God comes in and protects them, and they're multiplied. And then it happens again through the midwives. But then after verse 20, Pharaoh commands to throw all the sons of the Hebrews into the Nile. And there's no kind of rescue described. The chapter just ends. So the author means for us to read that the rescue plan begins in chapter 2. As well, we can see from this as the opening, because we don't know the timing of this. This is kind of setting the stage, that the beginning parts of Exodus, of this narrative, will be a battle between God and Pharaoh. Pharaoh seemingly acting shrewdly, a key word from 1 verse 10, but when you're opposing the plans of God, that may look like wisdom in the world, but it's folly, really. God will come through. So we know he comes through by multiplying them in verse 12 and multiplying them again in verse 20. But then when Pharaoh seeks to throw all the sons into the Nile, the narrative seemingly ends. And then in chapter 2, we're meant to read that this is the response to the third act of Pharaoh's aggression against God's people. It opens up with the story of a Levite man and a Levite woman who have a son named Moses. Okay, so that's important. Levi, those were the people, the tribe of Israel that becomes the priest of God. So you want to observe the who in that sentence, meaning Moses comes from a priestly line. The job of a priest, as we've gone over a couple times now, is to mediate between God and man. So this solution to the oppression of Pharaoh in chapter 2 it will be through a man that can bring his people before God. Now, like I said at the beginning, characters are extremely significant, and we learn a lot about them through their name. And so jump down to verse 10. Moses, we know the story, he's placed in a basket, and then Pharaoh's daughter pulls him out, or her maid, and brings her into Pharaoh's daughter. And then she says, she named him Moses because I drew him out of the water. Now, we also got to remember back to Genesis chapter 1. Okay? Water is what God creates the world out of, that deep darkness that his spirit is hovering over. Water in the Old Testament is seen as a negative thing, specifically the sea, but it brings in this connotation because you saw that the Pharaoh was throwing the babies into the water to kill them. And so the water is all typically seen as a negative, death kind of destructive place. But notice Moses is drawn out of that. And so Moses' name, Moshe in Hebrew, it means to draw out. Now, of course, the interpretation of that is, well, it's because Moses will one day draw his people out of Egypt. And just the same way he was drawn out of the water, he will draw the people of God through the Red Sea, through the water, through that chaos, out into the wilderness. And so that's one way to observe the characters, looking up what their name is in Hebrew and trying to think, how does that fit into the story? And Moshe, we see that it means to draw out. So he's a priest who draws the people out. Amazing. Okay? So let's continue on because now the story kind of speeds up. So it's a very interesting observation to know that from 1:8 all the way down to 2 verse 10, we don't know how much time that takes. And it's rather fast, but then we're given a little bit of a date in 2 verse 11. So if you're color coding with us here, this would be a good time to observe. One day, in verse 11 of chapter 2, when Moses had grown up. Now, the book of Acts really helps us in these initial passages. There's an interesting sermon by Stephen, one of the apostles that's appointed to join the 12. He preaches an incredible message kind of summarizing this portion of the Old Testament. And he adds some very interesting information about Moses. And so in Acts 7, verse 23, it says that when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. Okay, so we know that he's 40 years old. So what he was doing for those 40 years, there's much information, but most likely he was rising to prominence in the Egyptian government. Some sources say that he was actually made the chief of the whole entire army. And so when he's at this age, he goes out to his people. And look at we know the story, right? He goes out, and in verse 11, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he's looking on their burdens, and it's making him quite angry and frustrated, and so he kills the Egyptian. Then he goes out the next day, and he sees two Hebrews fighting each other. So it's a repetition, okay? And notice the words, these are key words in verse 14. Notice the words they used to describe Moses. Okay, they said, "Who made you prince and judge over us?" Well, we know later on that's essentially what Moses will become. He will become the leader of the people. And if we flip back to Acts chapter 7, we know that this is actually what was in the heart and mind of Moses. In verse 25 of Acts chapter 7, it says, "He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand." And so it's not just some random moment that Moses is walking, around the palace and all of a sudden sees an Egyptian beating up a Hebrew and intervenes. No, this was set in Moses' heart. This is the moment that I've been appointed for to bring the people out of Egypt. And he intentionally goes out to release them and free them from their burdens. A word that later on in chapter 6, verse 7, God says that's what he wants to do. But it's very interesting. They reject him, and they don't want him, and Moses flees to the wilderness, to Midian, to the land of Midian. Let's continue on with some observations here. This is now the third story in this small paragraph. Okay, so the first story in chapter 2 is Moses being drawn out of the water, and that hints at what he will one day do. Then it's Moses trying to achieve that by throwing off the Egyptian burdens from his people, but they reject him. Then the third narrative seemingly doesn't fit in. He runs out to the land of Midian, and he sees a group of female shepherds watering their flock, but they're being oppressed by male shepherds. And Moses jumps in, and there's some key words here in verse 17. "The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them." He intervened and brought salvation to an oppressed people. Exactly what he was trying to do to his own people, but they rejected him. And notice their description of him. In verse 19, it says that they thought he was Egyptian. We talked about that in the previous one, but it says in verse 19, they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand." So we have a third narrative where it's Moses saving and delivering people that are oppressed. Now, back then, these female shepherds out alone in the wilderness would have been the most vulnerable people, even more vulnerable than his own people. But they're the ones that see what God wants to do in and through Moses. Now let's do some interpretation here. What would these narratives mean to the people entering the land of Canaan? Well, the first off, the one from chapter 1, that would indicate that when the nations try to oppose God's plan, like Pharaoh trying to kill the babies, Pharaoh trying to oppress the people of God, there's always a but. God always comes through and always accomplishes his purposes. So as they're entering the land of Canaan and they're seeing the walls of Jericho and the other fortified cities, they would know that even though we have a feeble, fragile beginning, we're not like these other nations. God is still on our side, and he will still give us the delivery. Just as he saved the children in Egypt, he can save us now as a nation entering into Canaan. But then what about these rather interesting three narratives, okay? Or sorry, the two narratives at the end of chapter 2, where God's own people reject him. And then the only people that receive Moses's rescue at the hands of Moses are these shepherd ladies. Well, there's kind of three key people in chapters 1 to 2. There's Pharaoh, who rejects God. And then there's the people of Israel, who rejects God's saving agent, which is Moses. And then there's the shepherds, the female shepherds, that receive God's protection through the hand of Moses. Now, one way to, what that would mean to the original readers entering Canaan is that the people that really need God's protection are the ones that receive it, right? Pharaoh has no need for God, and he thinks he's acting wisely to thwart the plans of God. The Hebrew people, for some reason, they reject Moses, thinking that God will maybe provide another way, and not through Moses. Who made you prince and judge? But it's the shepherd ladies who are desperate. They'll take anyone to save them. Even an Egyptian, they'll take it. If he saves them and delivers them, they'll say yes. So for the original readers, as they enter Canaan, they're meant to enter it with this posture of desperation, right? That we can't do this on our own, and we can't do this in our own way. We need to be desperate for God to deliver and save us. How can that apply to our lives today? And one way to help bring application to the text is to take it out of the third level of the narrative, right, the individual story that we're in, and place it in the meta-narrative. And this story is very familiar. Think of it in the New Testament, right? When Jesus is born, the exact same thing happens. Herod tries to kill Jesus by killing all the babies, but God saves him. And it's because Herod has this political power to lose, right? He's the king of the Jews, and he's worried of an up-and-coming king of the Jews. So he has this political power to use, and so he opposes the plan of God. And then Jesus comes to his own people, right? To the Pharisees, to the Sadducees, and they oppose him. Why? Because they have religious power to lose. And they have a different plan in mind. God's going to save us a different way, not through Jesus. And so they oppose the plan of God. But who receives Jesus? Oh, it's beautiful. It's the people who are desperate for Jesus. It's the people who are desperate for God to come in and save them. It's the blind, it's the beggars, it's the people crying out on the side of the road for Jesus to save them. They're the ones. And there's a parable that Jesus even tells. He invites all these people to the wedding banquet, and they're like, "No, I don't have time for that. Oh, I got to go do this, I got to go do that." And Jesus says, "Okay, fine. Go to the people on the street corners, the beggars, bring them in. They'll eat anything. They're desperate." And all of a sudden, there's an incredible truth that we can apply to our lives. That if we have something to lose, it's very difficult to gain Jesus. If we have our own kind of political, like our own way of how our life should look, right? Our own protection, our own security, it's going to be hard for us to welcome Jesus into that life. Or if we have our own kind of list of rules and regulations to get to God, we don't really have a need for Jesus, and so we'll kind of push him aside as we try to follow our religious duties. But that's not the people Jesus is looking for. They're not going to see, they're going to miss him. It's the people who have a heart desperation for Jesus. They're the ones that are going to respond to his invitation. And so as we journey through the book of Exodus, which really is a journey that we can imitate with our lives, is that to get out of Egypt, to get out of our slavery and into the plan of God for our lives, we need to approach it with a certain desperation. And so that's a good example in chapters 1 and 2 of observation, interpretation, and application. We've observed that there's three narratives of people, of two groups rejecting God and one of people accepting God. And what would that mean to the original readers and hearers? And then what does that mean to our lives today? How do we not be in the group that's rejecting God, and why would we be there? And how can we be in the group that's accepting God's plan? Then the narrative jumps ahead, again, another 40 years. Okay, we learn about that later on in the book of Exodus, that Moses now becomes 80. So he's in the wilderness for 40 years. We'll come back to that because that's very important. That's a key setting in the story. and he sees a burning bush. He goes over to it, and it's God speaking to him out of the burning bush. And there's a common narrative theme, and it's called a dialogue, right? Where there's a character interacting with God. And these are remarkable exchanges. And in this story, you have 5 responses of Moses. And this is a great observation, to observe each of the 5 responses. You'll probably find them around the word but, where God is saying to do something, and Moses, and he has a different excuse. And so that's a great list to observe and think for the original readers when they're going into the land of Canaan. Is there any but in their mind? God can save us, but I don't think this time. But I don't think it's possible. I want to draw our attention to the second response, right? We talked about this a little bit, but it's key and central to the book of Exodus. Moses says in verse 13, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?'" So God of our fathers, that's the term they use to describe God up until this point in the story, right? The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, right? It's in a sense, it's the God that we've heard about. The God that has done these things in the lives of our fathers. But God, who are you today? Is in a sense what Moses is asking. And how do you relate to the gods of Egypt that we've essentially been enslaved to for many, many years? And God gives an incredible answer. It's not a name, it's more of a statement. In verse 14 it says, God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And then he gives a short version of that. Say to the people of Israel, "I am has sent me to you." Now this becomes the divine name, and that phrase, "I am who I am," that verbiage also is where the name Yahweh comes from. So anytime you're reading through your Bible and you read capital Lord, that's covering this unique, special, divine name, Yahweh, that sets God apart, the God of the Hebrew people, apart from the other gods. Now, what could this mean? Again, the people don't know who Yahweh is. And one way to read this, instead of "I am who I am," it's "I will be who I will be." Meaning, Moses, you and the people, you're going to get to know me personally. You've seen or heard what I've done for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but now it's your turn. And you're going to see me doing things in your lives. One commentator puts it like this: who he is and what he does will emerge in the history which yet lies ahead. I mean, God's inviting them into a journey. And of course it has to be, because at the present moment, they're enslaved. At the present moment, they're not free. So what positive act of delivery is this God going to do? And through that act of delivery, how are they going to learn about who he is? Again, the original readers going into Canaan. I will be who I will be. Meaning, as they enter Canaan, they know God is going to prove himself to them, prove his faithfulness. And this incredible name as God invites you and me on this journey, and we ask God, what are you going to do in my life? Who are you to me? I've seen who you are in my parents' life and in my culture's life, but who are you to me? And God says, I will show you. I will be who I will be. Come on this journey with me. So that's where we'll end this session. It's all the setting up, the beginning, preparing us for God's incredible act of delivery and rescue, which is the topic of our next session.